The train pulled into Larimer Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon, and nobody paid it much mind. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays in Larimer Creek had a way of feeling like every other day. Dust on the main street, horses tied to the post outside Donnelly's general store, a couple of old-timers sitting on the bench outside the barber shop watching the world move too slow. The mountains to the west threw long shadows, even in the middle of the day, and the air carried that particular Wyoming bite that visitors never quite got used to. Evelyn Harper stepped off the train last. She stood on the platform for a moment, not because she was hesitating, but because her legs had gone slightly numb from the 2-day ride, and she needed to be sure they would hold her. She was wearing a dress that had once been white. Now it was the color of old cream, with a yellow tinge around the hem where it had dragged through mud she couldn't remember the name of anymore, in a town she'd been glad to leave behind. The dress had a high collar and long sleeves, both of which served a purpose she didn't think about consciously anymore, covering things that didn't need to be seen by strangers. She had a small carpet bag in her right hand. That was everything. The station master, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pratt, who had been working the Larimer Creek platform for 11 years, watched her come down the steps and frowned. He was not a cruel man. He was simply the kind of man who noticed things that didn't fit. And a woman in a wedding dress arriving alone on the Tuesday afternoon train with no luggage to speak of was the sort of thing that didn't fit. "You need help, ma'am?" he asked, not unkindly. "No," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Her voice was steadier than she felt. She had practiced that, keeping her voice steady, the way some people practice piano scales, over and over until it became automatic. She looked out past the platform toward the main street of Larimer Creek. It was smaller than she'd imagined from Colt's letters, back when there had been letters, back when there had been anything between them besides silence and the distance that other people had engineered. She counted maybe 24 buildings from where she stood: a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, the general store, a sheriff's office with a crooked sign above the door. And there, standing at the far end of the platform, talking to a man she didn't recognize, was Colt Brennan. Her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the long train ride. He was bigger than she remembered, not in a dramatic way, not like some story where the hero comes back transformed. He was simply a man who had spent 5 years doing hard physical work, and it showed in the width of his shoulders and the way he stood, with that particular stillness of someone who didn't waste energy on motion that didn't need to happen. His hair was darker than it used to be, or maybe that was the light. He had a beard now, close-cropped, which he hadn't had when she'd last seen him. He hadn't seen her yet. For a moment, just a moment, and she would be embarrassed about it later, she thought about getting back on the train. Then she picked up her carpet bag and walked toward him. He saw her when she was about 20 feet away. She watched his face go through 3 distinct expressions in the space of about 2 seconds. The first was simple recognition. His eyes went slightly wider, the way anyone's do when they see something unexpected. The second was something she couldn't quite name, something that moved fast behind his eyes like a cloud crossing the sun. The third was the one that settled in and stayed, a hard, flat, closed expression that she had never seen on him before, and that told her, clearly and without any room for misunderstanding, that whatever she'd been hoping for when she'd gotten on that train, she wasn't going to find it easily. The man he'd been talking to noticed her too, glanced between them, and made a quiet excuse about needing to check on something. Nobody was ever specific in those moments. They just left. Evelyn stopped about 6 feet away from Colt, close enough to talk, far enough to make clear she wasn't assuming anything. "Colt," she said. He didn't say her name back. That told her something. "What are you doing here?" His voice was quiet. Not angry yet, just contained, like something with a lid on it. "I needed to find you. You needed to find me." He repeated it the way people do when they're trying to decide if something is as strange as it sounds. "After 5 years. Yes." He looked at the dress. She saw him look at it, saw him take in the state of it, and she watched something shift in his face that might have been pity or might have been contempt. She wasn't sure which would be worse. "Where's your husband?" he said. "Dead," Evelyn said. 8 months ago." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Colt didn't move, didn't blink, that she could see. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and the words were so perfectly correct and so completely empty of meaning that they almost made her laugh. No, you're not, she said. He looked at her sharply. And neither am I, she continued. Which is something I'll explain if you give me the chance. I know you don't want to. I know you have every reason in the world to tell me to get back on that train, but I'm asking you to hear me out. That's all I'm asking. A woman who had been sweeping the porch of the shop nearest the platform had stopped sweeping. 2 men across the street had gone still. Word moved fast in small towns, and a woman in a wedding dress was the kind of thing that moved faster than most. Colt glanced around. She could see him registering the audience, the way small-town people always registered it. Not with embarrassment exactly, but with a particular awareness of how this moment would become a story by supper time. This isn't the place, he said. I know. I'm not trying to make a scene. You showed up in a wedding dress, Evelyn. I know that too. She kept her voice even. It's the only dress I had that was clean enough to travel in. I didn't have much choice about it. He stared at her for a long moment. She let him. She had gotten good at letting people look at her and not looking away. Because looking away was something that people with something to hide did, and she had spent enough years being made to feel like she was the one hiding something. Come on, he said finally. He turned and walked toward the far end of the platform, away from the street, and she followed him. So they stood at the edge of the platform where the boards ended and the scrubby grass of the rail yard began, and Larimer Creek went about its Tuesday afternoon business behind them, and Colt Brennan crossed his arms and looked at her with those flat, closed eyes and waited. I didn't leave you, Evelyn said. She had planned to work up to this, to give context and background and all the things that might make it make sense. But standing in front of him, she found she couldn't work up to anything. I need you to know that first. Whatever else you think, whatever you were told, I did not leave you by choice. Something moved in his face, not softening, more like the opposite, like something that had been barely contained tightening further. What I was told, he said, was that you got a better offer, that you'd been promised to a man with money and land, and you took it. Your father told me that himself. My father lied to you. Your father had no reason to lie. My father had every reason to lie. He owed money to Franklin Hale's family going back 10 years, and the price of clearing that debt was me. She said it plainly, without drama, because she'd had years to get to the point where she could say it plainly. I was told the night before the wedding, not asked, told. And before you ask why I didn't run, I tried. They sent me back. Franklin's father had 2 men watching the roads out of Claremont, and when I tried to get to the telegraph office, they took me home, and my father told me that if I caused any more trouble, he'd make sure you found out about it in a way that would destroy your reputation in town. Colt's jaw was tight. I wrote to you, Evelyn said, twice in the first year. The letters came back unopened. I didn't know if you'd sent them back yourself or if someone else had intercepted them. After a while, I stopped trying because it seemed like it was only making things worse for both of us. And She stopped, breathed. I had to survive what I was surviving. I didn't have energy left over for much else. The silence stretched between them. Somewhere behind them, a horse whinnied. A door opened and closed. That's a very neat story, Colt said. She felt the sting of it but kept her face still. I know how it sounds. You know how it sounds, he repeated. It sounds like something somebody thought up on a 2-day train ride to explain away 5 years. It's the truth. And you expect me to just take your word for it? I don't expect anything, Evelyn said, and meant it. I know I don't have the right to expect anything from you. I came because I needed to tell you the truth, and because... She stopped again. This part was harder. Because the only thing that's kept me going, some days, was knowing that you were somewhere in the world, and that you deserve to know what actually happened. Even if it doesn't change anything, even if you send me back on the next train, you deserve to know. Colt looked at her for a long time. He had always been someone who thought before he spoke, who let the space between stimulus and response stretch longer than most people could stand. She had loved that about him once. Right now, it was excruciating. Where are you planning to stay? He said finally. I'll find a room, the hotel on the main street. That's Margaret Finley's place. She talks. I'm sure she does. Every person in this town will know your business by morning. Then they'll know it. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I'm not here to hide, Colt. I've done enough of that. He looked at her for another moment, then looked away, out toward the mountains. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. "I've got to get back to the ranch," he said. "I have a son. He's been sick, and I can't be away long." This surprised her, though she worked not to show it. "I didn't know. Nobody in Claremont would have known." A pause. "His name is Luke. He's 7 years old." Another pause. Harder. "His mother died when he was 2. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, and she meant it, unlike his earlier condolences. Something shifted in Colt's expression at that. Barely anything, but she caught it. He looked at her dress again, then looked away quickly, like he hadn't meant to. "I'll think about what you've said," he told her. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's enough," she said. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Some. The hotel was exactly what Colt had warned her it would be. Margaret Finley was a small woman in her 60s with bright, quick eyes and a mouth that seemed physically incapable of stopping. She showed Evelyn to a room on the second floor, and in the 10 minutes it took to walk up the stairs and unlock the door, Evelyn learned that the hotel had 16 rooms, that Margaret's late husband had built it in 1871, that the previous month a traveling medicine salesman had stayed in the third room on the right and left without paying, that the room at the end of the hall had a window that stuck, that the best breakfast in town was at the Finley Hotel if she did say so herself, and that Colt Brennan was the finest rancher in the county, even if things had been hard for him since Clara died. Clara was his wife, Margaret said, unnecessarily, as she opened the door to Evelyn's room. Lovely woman, very quiet. Not from around here originally. She and Colt were married, 9 years ago, I suppose. Had their boy Luke a couple years later. Then she took a fever and Margaret made a small gesture that communicated everything and nothing. It was hard on Colt, very hard. He's not been the same, and you can't blame him losing her like that. "No," Evelyn said, "you can't. And now his boy's been sick this past month. Some kind of chest trouble. Doc Hadley's been out there twice." Margaret set the room key on the dresser and turned to look at Evelyn properly for the first time since they'd come inside. Her eyes went to the dress. Of course they did. "You're not from around here either, are you?" "No, I came in on the afternoon train." "I noticed." A pause, the practiced pause of someone who considers themselves diplomatic. "Will you be staying long?" "I'm not sure yet." Margaret nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're filing information away. "Well, supper's at 6 if you're hungry, and if you need anything—" "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I appreciate your kindness." The kindness was relative, and both of them knew it. But Margaret took her leave with reasonable grace, and Evelyn closed the door and stood in the middle of the small room and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep inside her. The room had a narrow bed, a dresser with a clouded mirror, a window that looked out over the main street. She set her carpet bag on the bed and opened it. 2 dresses, both plain, a pair of boots that were better than the ones she was wearing, a small tin that had once held tobacco and now held the last of her money, $9 and some change, a photograph that she didn't let herself look at right now. She changed out of the wedding dress as quickly as she could, folding it and putting it at the bottom of the bag where she wouldn't have to see it, and put on the gray dress that was at least clean and presentable. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. They were not the hands she'd had at 22, when she and Colt Brennan had stood at the edge of his family's property and he'd asked her to wait for him while he got his ranch established enough to support a family. They were older hands now, more scarred. She'd worked hard in Franklin's house, not because she'd been asked to, but because working had been the only thing that gave her any control over her own life, any sense that she was a person, and not just a piece of furniture that occasionally got in Franklin's way. She thought about what Colt had said. His mother died when he was 2. A little boy, 7 years old, sick with chest trouble, growing up with only a father on a ranch in the Wyoming mountains. She thought about what that would look like. She thought about it more than she probably should have, sitting in a hotel room she could barely afford on her second day in a town that already had opinions about her. Then she stood up, put her boots on, and went downstairs to find out if Margaret Finley's supper was as good as she claimed. The dining room of the Finley Hotel had 6 tables, and that evening 5 of them were occupied. Evelyn was the only woman eating alone. She was aware of this the way you're aware of a splinter, not painful exactly, just present, requiring constant background attention. The other diners were a mix. 2 men who looked like traveling merchants, a family with 3 young children who were considerably more interested in each other than in Evelyn, and 2 women who were almost certainly there specifically to have a look at the stranger in the wedding dress, even if she wasn't wearing it anymore. They were polite enough to pretend otherwise, but Evelyn had grown up in a small town, and she knew the difference between genuine indifference and performed indifference. She ate her supper, beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was actually good, and tried not to appear to be thinking hard about anything, which was difficult because she was thinking hard about several things at once. The door to the dining room opened, and a woman came in who was not one of the original diners. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with graying brown hair pinned up efficiently, and the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and had the weathering to show for it. She scanned the room, landed on Evelyn, and walked directly over. "Mind if I sit?" she said. "Please," Evelyn said. The woman sat down, signaled to Margaret's girl who was serving, and looked at Evelyn without pretense. "I'm Ruth Aldcroft. I run the dry goods on the west side of Main Street, and before you ask, yes, I know who you are, and no, I didn't come to gossip. I came because I was curious." "About what?" "About a woman who rides 2 days on a train wearing a wedding dress to talk to a man who spent 5 years believing she abandoned him." Ruth accepted a cup of coffee from the serving girl with a nod. "That's either very brave or very foolish, and I generally like to know which." Evelyn studied her for a moment. "Probably both," she said. Ruth made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Fair answer." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Colt Brennan is not an easy man. He wasn't easy before, and losing Clara made him less so. He's a good man. I want to be clear about that. But good men who've been hurt have a particular way of making things difficult for people trying to help them." "I know," Evelyn said. "I knew him before all of that." Ruth looked at her carefully. "He told people you left him for a richer man. My father told him that. It wasn't true." Ruth drank her coffee. "And you're here to tell him the truth." "I already told him. Whether he believes me is another matter." "What do you want from him?" Ruth asked. It wasn't unkind. It was the kind of direct question that only certain people were comfortable asking, and Evelyn had learned to appreciate it. "Love? Forgiveness? Just to clear your conscience?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure anymore," she said honestly. "When I got on the train, I thought I knew. I thought it was about setting the record straight. But sitting here tonight, having actually seen him..." She stopped. "I don't know what I want. I know what I wanted 5 years ago, and I know I couldn't have it. What's left of that, if anything, I haven't figured out yet." Ruth nodded slowly. "The boy's sick," she said. "He told me. Luke is a good kid, smart, talks too much when he's well, which he hasn't been lately." A pause. "Colt's been running himself ragged between the ranch and sitting up with the boy at night. Doc Hadley's done what he can, but it's a chest cough that won't quite clear, and the wet weather's made it worse." She looked at Evelyn. "I mention it not to manipulate you, just so you understand the situation you've walked into." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "Most people in this town will not be kind to you," Ruth continued. "Not because they're cruel, well, some of them are, but because they like Colt, and they don't know you, and they've spent 5 years with his version of events. That's a long time for a story to get roots." "I know." "What are you going to do?" Evelyn looked down at her plate. "Stay," she said. "For now, at least. I didn't come this far to run away in the first 48 hours. Ruth studied her for another moment, then set down her coffee cup. "Good," she said, with a finality that seemed to close one chapter and open another. "In that case, if you need anything, say, work, or someone to talk to who isn't going to sell every word to the gossip mill, you know where my shop is." She stood, nodded once, and left. Evelyn watched her go, then looked down at her plate. The cornbread had gone cold while they talked. She ate it anyway. The next morning, Evelyn was up before sunrise. She'd slept badly, seen too many years of sleeping lightly, listening for sounds that meant danger. And by 4:30, she'd given up the pretense and sat by the window watching the main street of Larimer Creek go from black to deep blue to the gray of early morning. A dog crossed the empty street. A light came on in the bakery down the block. Somewhere a rooster decided it was time, though the sun hadn't agreed yet. She counted her money again. $9 and some change would cover maybe 10 days at the hotel, if she ate modestly. After that, she needed work, or she needed to move on. Moving on meant going somewhere that wasn't here, which meant giving up on whatever it was she'd come to do, or figure out, or say. She wasn't sure she was ready to call it giving up yet. She went downstairs for breakfast when the dining room opened at 6. The morning clientele was different from the evening. Working men mostly, stopping in before they opened their own shops, talking to each other in the comfortable shorthand of people who'd been neighbors for years. They glanced at her, and then went back to their conversations. The women who'd been watching her the night before were not there. She was on her second cup of coffee when the door opened and a young man came in. Boy, really, maybe 15 or 16, with a raw-boned look and a slightly anxious expression. He scanned the room, found her, and came over with the direct approach of someone who'd been sent on an errand and wanted to complete it efficiently. "Mrs. Hale?" he said. She had not heard that name in 8 months and had been trying to unhear it for longer. "I was," she said. "It's Harper now." "Miss Harper." He looked briefly uncertain, then apparently decided this was above his pay grade. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Pete Jessup. I work for Mr. Brennan. He asked me to come by and—" He looked at a point slightly above her head like he was reading something. "He said to tell you that if you want to come see the ranch, you're welcome to. This morning, if you like. I've got the wagon outside." Evelyn stared at him. "Colt sent you?" "Yes, ma'am." "This morning?" "Yes, ma'am. He was up early." Pete shifted his weight slightly. He didn't say why exactly, just that if you wanted to come, I should bring you. She thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "Let me get my coat," she said. The ride out to the Brennan Ranch took the better part of an hour, up into the foothills where the trail switched back and forth through scrubby pine and occasional aspen. Pete was not a talker, which she appreciated. The country was beautiful in the way that Wyoming was always beautiful. Not gentle, not easy, but with a scale and a clarity that made a person feel small in a way that was strangely reassuring. The mountains were close here. You were always aware of them, even when you weren't looking. Pete pulled the wagon up to the front of a house that was bigger than she'd expected. Not fancy, but solid, well-built, with the look of something that had been added onto over the years as money and time allowed. A barn stood to the left, newer looking than the house, its paint still relatively fresh. Fenced pastures stretched away to the south where she could see horses in the morning light. Colt was standing on the porch. He'd changed since yesterday, or maybe it was just that standing in his own place made him look different, more certain of himself, less defended, or maybe she was imagining it. "Miss Harper," he said, and she registered the correction he'd made in her name or the fact that Pete had passed it along. "Mr. Brennan." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. "Thank you for the invitation." "Come inside," he said. "Luke's up. He's been asking about you." She stopped. "He doesn't know me." "No? But Pete told him someone came in on the train yesterday and apparently described you in some detail." A pause. The wedding dress made an impression. "It tends to," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. She wasn't sure what to do with it. She followed him inside. Luke Brennan was small for 7, with his father's dark coloring and a watchfulness in his eyes that sat strangely on a child's face, the look of someone who had been alone with adults more than was entirely good for him. He was sitting up in a bed in the main room, propped against pillows, with a quilt around his shoulders, and the particular stillness of someone who'd been sick long enough that being still was no longer an effort. He looked at Evelyn when she came in and said without preamble, "Are you the lady from the train?" "I am," Evelyn said. She didn't crouch down to his level in the theatrical way adults sometimes did with children. She just stood and looked at him as if he were a person, which he was. "My name is Evelyn Harper." "Pete said you had on a wedding dress, but you weren't getting married." "That's correct." Luke considered this with the solemn seriousness of someone who found it genuinely interesting. "That's strange," he said. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "I was traveling, and it was the cleanest dress I had. It seemed better than the alternative." "What was the alternative?" "A dress with mud on the front." Luke nodded slowly. This apparently made sufficient sense. He shifted against his pillows and coughed, a deep, rattling sound that made Evelyn's stomach clench and made Colt move half a step forward from where he was standing near the door, though he stopped himself. She saw him stop himself. "You should have something warm to drink," she said to Luke. She looked at Colt. "Do you have honey? And if there's dried thyme or sage?" "For what?" Colt said. "For the cough. Honey dissolved in hot water with thyme if you have it. It won't fix what's wrong, but it'll make the coughing easier." She paused. "I spent a winter with a cook who swore by it. She wasn't wrong." Colt looked at her for a moment, then looked at Luke. Some calculation happened that she wasn't privy to. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "Help yourself." It wasn't trust. She knew it wasn't trust. It was closer to a provisional ceasefire, the kind that both sides maintained for practical reasons while keeping their hands near their weapons. But it was something. She went to find the honey. What? She stayed for most of the morning. Not because anyone asked her to. Colt didn't ask, and Luke was too polite to ask directly, though she could see he wanted to. She stayed because there were things that needed doing, and she could see them and do them, and she had spent too many years being forbidden to make herself useful to turn away from it now. The honey and thyme drink seemed to ease Luke's coughing, or at least he coughed less while she was there, which might have been coincidence. She helped him with a puzzle that had been abandoned on the table beside his bed. A wooden puzzle of interlocking pieces that was missing 3 pieces and was therefore technically unsolvable, but they worked at the parts they had and Luke talked while they worked, which she understood was probably a relief after days of being told to rest quietly. He told her about the horses by name and personality, about the dog they'd had who died last spring, about his friend Thomas at school who had given him a frog that his father had made him return. He told her that he liked arithmetic but hated penmanship, and that his teacher said his handwriting looked like a fence in a windstorm, which Luke thought was mean but privately agreed with. Colt moved in and out of the room. She caught him watching from the doorway once, and he moved on when he saw her notice. Around midday, when Luke had finally been persuaded to sleep, Evelyn found Colt in the kitchen. He was standing at the window looking out at the barn, with a cup of coffee in his hand that appeared to have gone cold some time ago. "He's sleeping," she said. "Good." He didn't turn around. She stayed near the door. "He's a good kid." "Yes." A pause. "He is." "He's lonely," she said. She hadn't meant to say it quite so directly, but it was true, and it seemed like the kind of thing that should be said. Not unhappy, but lonely. He talks like someone who doesn't have enough people to talk to. She saw Colt's shoulders tighten. "I know," he said. The 2 words had the sound of something he'd been carrying. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up, a sound like something large exhaling. "I'm not trying to tell you how to manage your own son," Evelyn said carefully. "I know that's not my place. I just noticed. You've been here 4 hours. I know that too." He turned around then. He looked tired in the daylight, not just from the immediate difficulty of a sick child, but with an older, deeper tiredness underneath that, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep. "Why did you really come?" he said. "Not the version you told me at the station, the real reason." She met his eyes. "I told you the real reason. You told me you wanted me to know the truth. That's not a reason to travel 2 days on a train." She was quiet for a moment. The wind outside pushed at the house, found the gaps in the window frame, made the curtain shift. "Because I spent 5 years surviving something I couldn't tell anyone about," she said. "Because Franklin Hale was the kind of man who made sure there was no one to tell. And when he died, I thought, I need to find the one person who was there before all of it. The one person who knew who I was before." She stopped. Her voice was steady, mostly. "I wasn't sure what I'd find when I got here. I didn't expect you to have a son, or a life that was fully built without me. I don't know what I expected, but I came because I had to go somewhere, and the only place that made any sense was here." No. Colt looked at her for a long time. "That's honest, at least," he said. "It's what I've got." He set down the cold coffee cup on the counter. "You should come back tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "Luke will want to finish the puzzle, the parts that are there, anyway." She understood what this was and what it wasn't. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. She put on her coat, picked up her carpet bag from where she'd left it by the door, and walked out into the Wyoming afternoon, where the clouds had come in thick and fast from the mountains, and the air smelled like something was on its way. Behind her, The door stayed closed, but it hadn't been locked. The clouds that had been building when Evelyn left the ranch that first afternoon delivered on their promise overnight. By morning, Larimer Creek was under a steady gray rain that turned the main street to mud and kept the sensible people indoors. Evelyn sat by her hotel window with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and watched the street and thought about the way Colt had said come back tomorrow. Not warmly, not with any particular invitation in his voice, but like a man who had made a decision and was committed to it before he could talk himself out of it. She had learned to pay attention to that kind of decision. The ones people made in spite of themselves were usually the ones they meant. She went back to the ranch. Pete came for her again with the wagon, quieter than before, which she hadn't thought was possible. The rain made the trail slow going, and by the time they arrived, her coat was damp at the shoulders, and her boots had taken on water somewhere around the second switchback. The ranch looked different in the rain, grayer, heavier, the mountains behind it swallowed by low clouds so that the whole property seemed to exist in a pocket of its own weather. Colt was in the barn when they arrived. He came out when he heard the wagon and looked at her standing in the drizzle for a moment without expression. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He held the barn door open a little wider, which she understood was as close to a welcome as she was likely to get. "Luke's been asking since breakfast," he said, and walked back inside. She followed him in out of the rain. The days that followed settled into a pattern before anyone formally decided on one. She arrived each morning, spent time with Luke, helped where help was needed, and left before supper. Colt did not invite her to stay for meals, and she did not push for it. The rhythm of it was cautious on both sides, like two people who had agreed to walk in the same direction without agreeing on the destination. Luke got better slowly, then worse for 2 days, then better again in the unsteady way that sick children did. His cough loosened gradually. By the 5th day, he was sitting up without the pillows propped behind him. By the 7th, he was arguing about whether he was well enough to go outside, which Colt said he wasn't, and Luke disputed loudly and at length. Evelyn stayed out of that particular argument, which was the right call because they were clearly practiced at it and didn't need a third party. What she noticed, watching them together, was that they were close in the way that people were close when they had only each other, deeply attached, occasionally impatient, sometimes frustrated by the very familiarity that made them comfortable. Colt talked to his son like a person, which not every father did. He listened when Luke talked, even when Luke talked too long about subjects that could not have interested him. Luke, for his part, watched his father with the particular attention of a child who has learned to read adult moods as a survival skill, not because his father was unkind, but because there was no one else to watch. It was Ruth Aldcroft who told her on the 3rd day what people were saying. Evelyn had stopped into the dry goods store that morning before Pete came to collect her, needing a spool of thread. Ruth was behind the counter rearranging something that probably didn't need rearranging, and when the bell above the door announced Evelyn, she looked up and said without preamble, "Bettina Marsh was in here yesterday." "I don't know who that is," Evelyn said. "You will. She knows everyone and makes it her business to know everyone's business first." Ruth set down what she was holding. "She says you showed up because Colt Brennan is the most established rancher in the county and his wife is 2 years dead and you saw an opportunity." Evelyn selected a spool of brown thread from the rack. "That's one interpretation. She also says your first husband left you with debts and you're looking for someone to pay them." "He did leave debts. I didn't bring them with me." Ruth looked at her with frank curiosity. "You don't seem particularly bothered." "I've been the subject of worse rumors than that," Evelyn said. She brought the thread to the counter and opened her coin purse. "In Claremont, by the end, I think most people believed I was either a fool or a saint, or both. Neither was accurate. What were you?" "Stuck." She said it simply. "I was stuck, and then I wasn't." Ruth made a small sound, something between a hum and a sigh. "Bettina's been talking to people, the kind of talking that moves in a particular direction. You should know that." "Thank you for telling me." "I'm not telling you to scare you off." Ruth handed her the change with careful deliberateness. "I'm telling you because if you're planning to stay, you should know the landscape." Evelyn pocketed the change. "I'm planning to stay," she said. She meant it more definitely than she had the first time she'd said it. The landscape, as Ruth had put it, became clear over the following days. It expressed itself in small things. The way two women who'd been talking on the sidewalk outside Donnelly's went quiet when Evelyn walked past, then resumed when she was at a sufficient distance. The way Gerald Pratt at the train station looked through her when she went to check on a package she'd sent ahead from the last town she'd passed through. The way Bettina Marsh herself, a tall woman with the upright posture of someone who considered their own opinion load-bearing, managed to be in the same part of the hotel dining room as Evelyn twice, which was too many times to be coincidence in a room with only 6 tables, and managed each time to be speaking just loudly enough about the poor judgment of women who arrived uninvited into other people's lives. Evelyn ate her meals and kept her face neutral and did not give Bettina Marsh the satisfaction of a reaction. What was harder to manage was the way it affected her at the ranch. Not directly. No one at the ranch treated her unkindly. Pete had warmed to her in his quiet way, and Luke was openly enthusiastic about her presence in the way that children were when they decided they liked you and saw no reason to be complicated about it. But she was aware, every day she was there, that her presence was a topic of conversation in town, and that the conversations were making their way back to Colt. She knew this because she could see him processing something on the days when it had happened. He'd be working at something, mending harness, or going over the accounts at the kitchen table, and he'd have a particular quality of silence that was different from his regular silence, more internal, like someone arguing with themselves in a language that didn't have words. She didn't ask. She felt she hadn't earned the right to ask, not yet. On the 8th day, he asked her something first. They were in the barn. She'd come out to get Luke's dog, which had escaped from the main room and was creating chaos among the chickens, and Colt was in the far stall doing something with a mare that had a front leg wrapped in linen bandaging. He didn't look up when she came in. "Helen Marsh came by yesterday," he said. "Bettina Marsh's mother?" "Aunt. She told me what people are saying about why you're here." Evelyn caught the dog, who submitted to being caught with minimal dignity. She held it under one arm. And I told her it wasn't her concern. He still didn't look up. She didn't appreciate that. "I expect not." She said I was making a mistake. A pause, a long one, while he checked the bandage and decided it was satisfactory. "She's probably not the only one thinking it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The dog squirmed. She adjusted her grip. "Is she right?" Colt looked up then. He studied her for a moment in the way he did, that unhurried, considering look that most people couldn't hold. She held it. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's an honest answer. I'm trying to be honest, even when it's not particularly comfortable." He turned back to the mare. "I think you're honest too. I haven't decided what to do with that yet." She carried the dog back to the house and thought about that for the rest of the day. Luke was almost fully recovered by the end of the 2nd week, which was a relief and also introduced a new problem. He no longer needed Evelyn to be there for any practical medical reason, and both of them knew it, and neither of them brought it up. She kept coming. Colt kept letting her come. Luke didn't question it because from his perspective there was nothing to question. Evelyn was simply there, the way the mountains were there, and he had adapted quickly and thoroughly to her presence the way children did when they decided something was good. He started teaching her to play checkers, which she actually already knew how to play, but pretended to be worse at than she was, because watching him explain the rules with tremendous seriousness was one of the better things that had happened to her in recent memory. "You can't move that one there," he said, pointing at the board with the authority of someone who had given this matter serious thought. "That's the wrong direction." "I thought you could go any direction." "No." He looked at her with patient disbelief, the expression of someone explaining something to an adult who really should know better. "Red goes this way, black goes that way. Papa taught me. He's very good." "Better than you?" Luke considered this seriously. "He beats me most times, but I almost beat him last week." A pause. "He said I let him win, but I didn't. He lost because I got 2 of his pieces when he wasn't paying attention." "That sounds like a win to me." "That's what I said." He moved his piece with decisiveness. He said, "I need to think more about what comes next, and not just what's in front of me. But I think sometimes what's in front of you is enough to worry about." Evelyn looked at the board and thought that was probably the most accurate thing she'd heard in a long time. "Your father's not wrong either," she said. Luke moved another piece. Are you going to stay? He asked, in exactly the same tone he'd used to discuss checkers strategy, as if the subject change was perfectly natural. She looked at him. I don't know yet, she said carefully. That depends on a lot of things. Like what? Like whether my being here is good for everyone, not just for me. Luke frowned. I like you being here. I know. I like being here. She paused. But there are other people whose feelings matter too. He thought about this. You mean Papa? Partly. He likes you being here, Luke said, with the confidence of someone reporting an observed fact. He doesn't act like it all the time, but he does. Luke screwed up his face trying to find the right word. He was different before you came. More quiet. The bad kind of quiet, not the regular kind. Evelyn kept her expression carefully neutral. What's the bad kind of quiet? When everything is fine and nobody says it's not fine, but you can tell something is wrong anyway. He looked at her. You know what I mean? Yes, she said. I know exactly what you mean. The storm came on a Thursday. It arrived the way bad weather often did in Wyoming, faster than it had any right to, with the mountains gathering clouds in the afternoon and the temperature dropping a full 20 degrees by the time the sun went down. By nightfall, the rain had turned to something harder, and by midnight it was a full mountain storm, the kind with winds that came in at an angle and found every gap in every structure and made a sound like a sustained argument. Evelyn was at the hotel when it started. She lay awake listening to the wind for a while, and then she thought about Luke's cough, which had been almost clear but not quite, and about the way cold air affected chest complaints, and about the hour-long mountain trail between here and the ranch, and about the fact that Colt had been managing everything alone for 5 years, including a sick child and a ranch and whatever was going on inside him. And she made a decision that she was aware was reckless and made it anyway. She dressed in the dark, put on every layer she had, left a note for Margaret under the door of her room so the woman wouldn't think she'd been murdered or run off, and went to find the livery stable. The livery man, whose name she'd learned was Amos Pruitt, and who was the least excitable person she'd yet met in Larimer Creek, looked at her standing in the doorway of his stable at 1 a.m. in the middle of a mountain storm with the expression of a man who had seen stranger things, which he probably had. I need to get to the Brennan Ranch, she said. In this, he said. Not a question. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. You know that trail? I've been out 3 times this week. I know it well enough. He thought about this. I've got a gray mare that knows it better than you do, he said finally. She'll take care of herself if you let her. Don't try to lead her. Just guide her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He went to get the mare. The ride was bad. She wouldn't describe it afterward as anything other than bad. The wind drove rain and sleet sideways. The trail was slick with mud and the occasional patch of ice where the temperature had dropped faster on the exposed sections. And twice the mare stopped and she thought they'd have to turn back. But the mare was as good as Amos had said, and Evelyn held on and let the horse pick the path and tried not to think about what she was doing or why or whether it was sensible, because she already knew it wasn't sensible, and thinking about it wouldn't help. She arrived at the ranch sometime after 2 a.m. The light was on in the main room. Colt was at the door before she'd finished tying the mare, which meant he'd heard her coming. He stood in the doorway holding a lantern and looked at her, soaked, muddy, slightly windswept in a way that suggested she'd had an argument with the weather and come out even at best. And for a moment he just looked. What are you doing? He said. I was worried about Luke. She came up onto the porch and pulled back her hood. The cold air and his chest. He's fine. He's asleep. Good. She stood there dripping onto the porch boards. Good. He looked at her for another moment. You rode out here in this, he said. In the middle of the night. Yes. By yourself. Amos Pruitt's mare knows the trail. Colt closed his eyes briefly, the way someone did when they were deciding how to respond to something that had no fully adequate response. Then he stepped back and held the door open. Get inside before you freeze, he said. The main room was warm. He'd had the fire built up, which suggested he'd been awake for a while. Luke's bedroom door was closed. The house had the particular stillness of somewhere that had been quiet for hours and had gotten used to it. Colt found her a blanket and something dry to change into, one of his shirts and a pair of trousers that she had to belt with a piece of rope from near the wood box, which was not elegant but was warm. He did not watch her change. He went to the kitchen and she could hear him doing something with the stove. When she came out, he put a cup of hot coffee in her hands without asking if she wanted it. She sat in the chair nearest the fire and wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the warmth coming back into her fingers, which had gotten genuinely cold on the ride. Colt sat in the other chair. The fire was between them and slightly to the left, and it threw uneven light that made the room look larger and smaller at different moments. "You could have been hurt," he said, not angry. Something more complicated than angry. "I know. Why didn't you send a message in the morning if you were worried, or come by daylight?" "Because by morning something might have been wrong." She looked into the fire. "And because—" She stopped, tried to find the honest version of this. "Because doing nothing when I was worried about him wasn't something I could make myself do, even if the worry turned out to be unnecessary." The fire made sounds. Outside, the storm made sounds. Between the two, the room felt insulated from the world in a way that was probably artificial and temporary, but felt real. "It matters to me," she said finally. "He matters to me. I know I don't have any right to. He's not mine. I know that. I'm not trying to claim anything I haven't earned. I'm just telling you that it's true." Colt didn't say anything for a long time. "He talks about you," he said finally. "Constant. What Evelyn said, what Evelyn thinks about this, what Evelyn showed him how to do." A pause. "He hasn't talked that much since before Clara died." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. Not a bad feeling. A complicated one. "I'm glad," she said quietly. Another silence. The fire settled, sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. "I didn't receive your letters," Colt said. She looked at him sharply. He was looking at the fire. "I went back to Claremont after. 6 months after the wedding. I was going to confront your father. A friend of mine talked me out of it, told me it would only make things worse. But while I was there—" He stopped, reorganized. "I talked to a woman who worked in the telegraph office. She told me that in the months before I came back there'd been some irregularities, letters going missing. She didn't know details. But she mentioned it." Evelyn was very still. "I didn't do anything with that information," Colt said. "I told myself it didn't matter, that it was too late to matter." He paused. "I've been thinking about it since you got here." "You didn't say anything?" "I needed to think first." He looked at her then. The firelight made his face harder to read, or maybe she was just aware of how much she'd been reading into things she couldn't actually see. "If the letters were intercepted," he said carefully, "then you tried to reach me." "Yes." "And I spent 5 years believing you didn't." "Yes." The word fell into the room and stayed there. He looked away. She watched him work through something. Whatever it was internal, and she wasn't going to be invited into it. Not tonight. That was all right. She understood the need for things to stay internal while you were still figuring out their shape. "You should sleep," he said. "The storm's not going to clear until morning. You can take Luke's room. He can sleep in with me tonight." "You don't have to." "It's not an argument, Evelyn." His voice was tired. Not unkind, just tired, in the way of someone who had been carrying things for a long time and had just been shown that some of what he was carrying might need to be set down and examined before he could figure out what it actually weighed. "Get some sleep." She got some sleep. Atti. In the morning, the storm had cleared enough to show what it had done. Branches down along the trail, the south pasture fence broken in 2 places where a tree limb had come down on it. The vegetable garden behind the house that Evelyn had noticed was mostly surviving, being now somewhat less so. Pete showed up an hour after dawn looking like he'd fought the storm personally and come out roughly even, and he and Colt went to deal with the fence. Luke came into the kitchen while his father was outside and found Evelyn making oatmeal. He stopped in the doorway. His face went through a brief sequence of surprise, pleasure, and then the studied nonchalance of someone who had decided to play it cool. "You stayed," he said. "The storm kept me." She stirred the oatmeal. "Sit down." He sat down. He watched her with the attention he gave to things that interested him, which was a different quality from the attention he gave to things he was merely observing. This was the interested kind. "I heard you come in last night," he said. "Did you? I was trying not to wake anyone." "I heard Papa talking too." He paused. He sounded different. Different how? Luke thought about this with the serious consideration he applied to most things. Less like he was holding his breath, he said. She looked at him. He does that sometimes, Luke explained. Holds his breath in his talking, like there's something he's not saying. He looked at her. He wasn't doing that last night. She turned back to the oatmeal before the expression on her face could give away more than she meant to. Eat your breakfast, she said, and her voice came out almost steady. Biscuit? She found the first piece of the real trouble on a Tuesday, which was 2.5 weeks after she'd arrived in Larimer Creek and 3 days after the storm. She was in Ruth Aldcroft's shop, picking up some flour and sugar that Ruth had set aside for her, when a man she'd seen but not met came in. Tall, with the overconfident bearing of someone who had money and knew it and wanted you to know it too. He was maybe 45, dressed better than the weather and the mud outside warranted, and he walked into the store the way people walked into spaces they considered their own. He looked at Evelyn, and his expression shifted in a way she'd learned to recognize over 5 years in Franklin Hale's house. It wasn't exactly contempt. It was the assessment of a man who had decided what category something belonged to before getting a good look at it. "You're the woman from the train," he said. "Yes," she said. "Gerald Marsh." He didn't extend his hand. "I run the Larimer Creek Land Office." "Miss Harper," she said. Something moved in his face at the name. Not recognition exactly, but something close to it. A filing away. "I hear you've been spending time out at the Brennan property," he said. His tone was friendly in the way that a trap was friendly. Everything smooth until the moment it wasn't. "I've been visiting," she said carefully. "Brennan's a good man," Marsh said. "He's had a hard few years. A lot of people in this town care about how things go for him." He looked at her. "I hope you understand what I'm saying." She met his eyes. "I understand you perfectly, Mr. Marsh." Ruth was behind the counter. She said nothing, but Evelyn caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Marsh smiled, which did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Good. Glad we understand each other." He nodded at Ruth. "Ruth." And he left. The bell above the door rang once, and then it was quiet. "Gerald Marsh," Ruth said, "has been trying to buy the Brennan property for 3 years. Evelyn looked at her. "What?" "The Northwest pasture, particularly. There's water rights attached to it that Marsh wants for his own holdings." Ruth's voice was careful and precise, like someone measuring out something that needed to be measured exactly. Colts refused every offer. The last time was about 4 months ago, and it was not a friendly conversation by all accounts. Evelyn thought about the way Marsh had looked at her, the assessment, the implied warning. "He thinks I'm a complication," she said. "I think," Ruth said slowly, "he thinks you might make Colt either distracted or vulnerable, depending on how things go. Either way, he considers you a variable he'd rather not have in the equation." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The flour and sugar sat on the counter between them, ordinary and patient. "How much does Colt know about what Marsh has been doing?" "What he can see," Ruth said. "Whether he knows all of it, that I can't tell you." Evelyn picked up her packages. "He should know," she said. "Yes," Ruth agreed. "He should." She walked back out into the pale November sunlight of Larimer Creek, and somewhere behind her she could feel the town watching, weighing, deciding what she was and whether she belonged here. She walked as if none of that mattered, because she had learned that the way you carried yourself in a place was its own kind of statement, and right now the only statement she had available to her was the fact that she was still here and still walking forward and wasn't planning to stop. It wasn't much, but it was something. She told Colt about Gerald Marsh the next morning. She'd thought about waiting, giving it another day, finding the right moment, making sure she had all the information she needed before she said anything. But she'd spent 5 years waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had a way of never quite arriving, and she'd learned, slowly and at some cost, that the instinct to wait was sometimes the right call, and sometimes just fear wearing a sensible coat. She told him in the barn while he was working on the fence repair, because that was where he was and there wasn't going to be a better setting. She told him what Marsh had said in Ruth's store, and what Ruth had told her afterward about the land offers and the water rights. And she told him plainly and without editorial comment, because it wasn't her place to tell him what to make of it, only to make sure he had the information. Colt listened without interrupting. He kept working while she talked. not dismissively, just because he was the kind of man who needed his hands occupied while his mind was doing something else. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Ruth told you about the water rights," he said. "Yes." "How much did she tell you?" "That Marsh has been trying to buy the Northwest pasture for 3 years, that you've refused, that the last time wasn't friendly." Colt set down the hammer. He looked at the fence post for a moment, then looked at her. "The last time," he said, "Marsh told me that isolated ranchers had a way of running into trouble when they didn't have friends in the right places. He said it exactly that pleasantly." "That's a threat." "That's what I thought." He picked up the hammer again. "I've been careful since then. Kept the property records current, stayed on the right side of every legal requirement I could think of. It's hard to move against someone who's done everything right." "And now I'm here," Evelyn said. He looked at her sideways. "He sees me as a distraction," she said, "or a complication that might make you careless." "Are you?" She held his gaze. "Not if I can help it." He went back to work. She watched him for a moment, then picked up the other end of the fence rail and held it in place while he drove the nail, because it needed 2 people and there were only 2 of them there, and standing around watching seemed like the wrong choice. They worked like that for a while without talking, which was different from the silences earlier in her time here. Those had been silences with edges. This one was something quieter. The thing Evelyn had not accounted for, in all the calculating she'd done before coming to Larimer Creek, was that she would have to manage what was happening inside herself at the same time as everything else. She had come here with a purpose: to tell the truth, to correct a record that had been falsified, to find some kind of footing in a life that had been upended so thoroughly she sometimes couldn't remember what it had felt like before. She had not come here expecting to feel things she'd spent years pressing down into manageable sizes, and she found that being near Colt again, and being near Luke, and being in a place that felt more like a home than anywhere she'd lived in 5 years, was causing those things to expand again at an inconvenient rate. She handled it the way she handled most inconvenient things, by staying busy and not looking directly at it. She mended things. She cooked when cooking was needed, which it was more often than not because Colt's cooking was functional rather than good. A fact Luke communicated through the diplomatic medium of making very different sounds when she cooked versus when his father did. She fixed the latch on the kitchen window that had been catching wrong. She helped Pete with the horses on a morning when Colt was in town, and discovered that she was better with horses than she'd thought she was. Or maybe she'd always been decent with them and had simply not been in a position to find out. The town, meanwhile, did not improve. Bettina Marsh, who turned out to be Gerald Marsh's wife, a fact Ruth mentioned with the dry tone of someone reporting a natural disaster, had apparently decided that Evelyn was a project, not a welcome project, the kind of project people undertook to remove things that didn't belong. She encountered it in layers. The way Bettina and her circle occupied the dining room at the hotel, with a particular territorial energy on the evenings Evelyn was there. The conversation she overheard in Donnelly's general store, not quite loud enough to be obviously intentional, not quite quiet enough to be clearly accidental, about the kind of woman who attached herself to widowers with property. The way people in the street sometimes looked at her and then found somewhere else to look, quickly, as if looking too long might imply something. None of it was enough to fight directly. That was the design of it. She talked to Ruth about it one afternoon when the shop was quiet and Ruth was doing her books, and Evelyn had stopped in with no particular errand, and both of them knew it. "She's been at this for 3 years, Ruth said, not looking up from her ledger. "Bettina, I mean. She ran off the last woman who showed any interest in Colt, widow from Cheyenne who came to visit her cousin and stayed 2 extra weeks. How? Talked. And then talked more. And then made the woman's cousin understand that the cousin's business in town might find things more difficult if she kept encouraging the friendship. Ruth turned a page. Bettina is strategic, which people mistake for being clever. She's not particularly clever. She just has patience, and she knows which doors to knock on. Why does she care so much about Colt? Ruth looked up then. Because her husband wants that land and she wants what her husband wants. Colt marrying again, marrying the right person, someone from a good family with connections and social standing, might make him harder to isolate. But Colt making a questionable match, or worse, being made to look like a man with poor judgment. She let the implication hang. Evelyn looked at the counter. The wood was worn smooth in the places Ruth's hands rested most often. "She's trying to make me the questionable match," Evelyn said. "She's trying to make you the evidence that Colt isn't thinking straight." Ruth closed the ledger. "The problem for her is that so far Colt's doing exactly what Colt always does, which is make up his own mind regardless of what anyone thinks about it." "So far," Evelyn said. "So far," Ruth agreed. Yet, the moment that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into Evelyn's time in Larimer Creek, and it came not from Bettina Marsh or Gerald Marsh or anything she'd anticipated, but from Luke. She had been in the main room with him. He was well enough now to be up and about. Though Colt had drawn the line at going outside in the cold, a ruling Luke contested daily and lost daily. And they'd been playing checkers, and Luke had just executed a move that was technically against the rules, but showed such genuine strategic creativity that she hadn't had the heart to correct him immediately. When he looked up and said, "Evelyn, what happened to your arm?" She went still. He was looking at her left forearm. Her sleeve had ridden up slightly during the game. She'd been reaching across the board, and the edge of a scar was visible just below the cuff. Old, faded to a silvery brown that meant it had been there for years, but visible. She pulled the sleeve down. The movement was automatic, practiced, done before she'd consciously decided to do it. Luke looked at her with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions you don't ask, and also with the particular sensitivity of a child who can tell when an automatic response means something hurt. "Did you fall?" he said. "A long time ago," she said. Her voice was steady. She had gotten very good at steady. "It's big," he said, not unkindly, just observing. "Yes." She moved a checker piece. "Your turn." He looked at the board, then looked at her. He was 7, but he was not, in the ways that mattered, a simple 7. "Are there more?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought about the right answer, the careful answer, the answer that would redirect and normalize and close the subject gently. "Yes," she said. Luke nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone receiving important information. Then he moved his piece and said nothing more about it, and they finished the game, and he won because she let him, or possibly because he was genuinely better than her at this point, which she was not entirely willing to concede. But she sat with the conversation for the rest of the afternoon. She sat with the way the question had felt. Not terrible, not unbearable, just surprising in the way that things were surprising when you'd spent years protecting them, and then someone touched them without realizing what they were touching. She sat with the fact that she had answered honestly, which she hadn't planned, and with the fact that the honest answer hadn't destroyed anything. She was still sitting with it when Colt came in from the pasture an hour before supper and found Luke in the kitchen telling him that Evelyn had scars on her arm from a long time ago, and he wanted to know if she was okay. She heard this from the main room, where she was supposed to be reading and was instead listening through the partially open door with the complicated feelings of someone who has had their privacy both violated and not violated simultaneously. Colt's response was low and she couldn't hear all of it, but she heard the tone of it, which was careful and deliberate, and she heard Luke say, "But I just asked," and Colt say, "I know," and she answered, "So that's between you and her." There was a pause. "Is she okay, though?" Luke said. Another pause. "I hope so," Colt said. "Go wash your hands." Colt did not ask her about it that evening. He was careful around her in a way that was different from the usual careful, more deliberate, like a man walking around something he could see but hadn't yet decided how to approach. She let him be careful. She ate supper with them because by now supper had quietly become an assumption rather than an invitation, and she helped Luke with the reading he'd been given to catch up on from school, and she and Colt talked about the fence repair and the weather coming in, and a horse that Pete was worried about, and none of it was about anything other than what it appeared to be, and that was fine. She left after Luke went to bed. Colt walked her out to where Amos Pruitt's gray mare was tied. She'd been borrowing the horse regularly now, with Amos's complete and matter-of-fact permission, and stood in the cold while she got her coat buttoned. "Luke told me about your arm," he said. "I know. I heard. He was looking at the mountains, or at the place where the mountains were, which was invisible in the dark. You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. But I'm also, but—" He stopped, started again. "If he hurt you, Evelyn, if that's what those scars are from, I need to know that you're... Another stop. He was not a man who abandoned sentences midway through, as a rule, and the fact that he kept doing it said something about the state of things. I'm all right, she said. Now. Now, he repeated. She looked at him. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were extraordinary the way they only were at altitude. And in that light, she made a decision that she hadn't been planning to make tonight, or perhaps ever, the way some decisions came. Not reasoned into, but arrived at, like you'd been moving toward them all along without knowing. Come inside, she said. There's something I should tell you. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the rest of the house quiet, and Evelyn told him about Franklin Hale. Not all of it at once. It came out the way things that had been kept in the dark for a long time came out. Not in a clean narrative, but in pieces. Some in order and some not, with silences between them where she was deciding what came next or deciding if she could say it. She told him about the first year, which had been bad but survivable, when she'd still believed that compliance and patience might eventually make things easier. She told him about the way she'd learned not to disagree in public because the correction for public disagreement came in private, and it came hard. She told him about the letters she'd written, both of them, and the second one that she'd seen the result of. A bruise on her right cheekbone for 2 weeks, and an instruction never to communicate with people from her previous life. Colt sat across from her and did not move. His face went through things she couldn't fully track in the lamplight, but she could see the line of his jaw getting tighter, and a particular stillness in his hands that was the stillness of effort, of someone holding something in because releasing it would not help anything. She told him about the scar on her arm, which was the most visible one, and therefore, in a way, the easiest to explain. There were others. She told him about those too. Not where they were, that was more than the moment required, but that they were there, and how they'd gotten there, with the flatness in her voice that came from having had to make peace with the facts before she could state them. When she stopped talking, the kitchen was very quiet. Colt's hands were flat on the table, pressed down as if he needed something solid under them. How long? He said. His voice was low, not soft, controlled, the way a fire was controlled when someone was working to keep it from becoming something they couldn't manage. The marriage lasted 6 years. The worst of it was probably years 3 through 5. She looked at her own hands on the table, ordinary looking, with their ordinary looking scars. The last year was better. He was sick, lung trouble. He didn't have the energy. And when he died... When he died, I stayed in the house for 2 months because I didn't know where to go. Then I sold everything I could sell and I got on a train. She paused. I didn't plan specifically to come here. I bought a ticket and then sat in the station and thought about where to go, and the only answer I had was here. Colt looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She had promised herself before she started talking that she would not look away, not because she had something to prove, but because she had spent enough time hiding and she was done with it. Your father knew, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And he needed the debt cleared. That was the more important thing. She heard how flat she sounded saying it and couldn't make herself sound otherwise because there was no version of that sentence that had feeling in it she was willing to access right now. I don't think he's a bad man exactly. I think he was scared and he made a choice that was easier for him than it was for me, and I think he has probably found ways to live with that. I don't know. I haven't seen him in 5 years. Colt was quiet for so long that she started to wonder if she'd said too much, gone further than the evening had prepared the ground for, broken something that had been slowly being built by giving it more weight than it could hold. Then he said, I should have come back to Claremont sooner, before 6 months. She stared at him. That wasn't on you. I know what was on me and what wasn't. His voice was rough now. I knew your father was capable of maneuvering. I knew the letters had possibly been intercepted. I spent 6 months telling myself it didn't matter and not doing anything about it, and then I went there and talked myself out of confronting him, and I came home, and He stopped. I told myself you'd made your choice. I made it easy for myself to believe that because the alternative was worse. The alternative was knowing I'd been taken away from you and couldn't be reached, she said carefully. Yes, the word came out rough. That was the alternative. The lamp between them flickered. One of the logs in the stove settled with a heavy sound. I spent 5 years angry at you, he said. That anger was useful. It was easier than missing you and not being able to do anything about it. He looked at the lamp rather than at her. And now I find out that you were... He stopped again. Something in his face moved that she didn't have words for. That you were surviving what I just described, and I was here being angry, and I didn't... You couldn't have known. I could have tried harder to find out. Maybe. She was quiet for a moment. And I could have found another way to reach you. I could have been braver. I've had 5 years to think about all the things I could have done differently. That's not the same thing, and you know it. I know, she said. But I'm telling you that the accounting isn't entirely one-sided. We both made choices that made things worse. Some of them were fear, and some of them were pride, and some of them were just not knowing what we were dealing with. She paused. I'm not here to assign blame, not to you, not to my father, not even to Franklin, entirely, though he has the largest share of it. I'm here because I want to put it behind me. All of it. And I can't do that while the story between us is unfinished. Colt looked at her. What would finishing it look like? He said. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I think it starts with both of us knowing what actually happened. He was quiet for a long time after that. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned that some silences needed to exist at their full size. You should take the room tonight, he said finally. It's late and the trail's bad in the dark. Colt eat, not because of anything else, he said. Just because it's late and you rode out here in worse conditions and you don't need to do it again. He stood up from the table. I'll get the lamp for the hallway. She sat at the table after he left the room and listened to the quiet of the house and the faraway sound of wind in the pine trees outside, and felt something that had been rigid in her chest for a very long time. Shift slightly, not into a better position exactly, just into a different one. Less fixed, more like something that could move. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't anything as clean as that, but it was real, which was more than she'd had in a long time. She left early the next morning before Luke woke, because she needed to think, and thinking was easier in motion. The ride back to town was cold and clear, the storm of the previous week having scoured the air to something almost too transparent, the mountains showing every ridge and snow line with a sharpness that seemed almost aggressive. She was halfway down the trail when she heard a horse behind her. She turned in the saddle. Colt was coming down the trail at an easy pace, his breath and the horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. He pulled up alongside her, didn't say anything immediately. They rode together in silence for a stretch of trail that ran along the edge of a small ravine, the pines close on either side. I owe you an apology, he said. You already... Not for last night, for the first day, at the station. He kept his eyes on the trail. The way I spoke to you, I wasn't kind. You had reason not to be. I had reason to be confused and angry, not reason to be unkind. Those are different things. A pause. Clara used to tell me that I had a way of making people feel like they were on trial, that it was a habit I'd built without noticing. He was quiet for a moment. She was right about most things. Evelyn looked at the trail ahead of them. She sounds like she was good, she said. She was. Simple, not performative. She was a good person and a good mother, and I miss her. That's the whole of it. I know, Evelyn said. And then, because it was true and she thought it needed to be said, you don't have to choose between missing her and whatever this is. That's not how it works. He looked at her then. Whatever this is, he said. I don't know what to call it, she said. I'm not trying to name it. I'm just saying. I'm not asking you to stop grieving anything to make room for me. That's not what I came here for. They rode out of the tree line where the trail opened up, and the full valley spread below them, Larimer Creek visible at the bottom with its small cluster of buildings, and the thin smoke from morning fires going up into the clear, cold air. What did you come for? He said. The real answer. The one you gave me in the kitchen wasn't the whole of it. She considered. The mare's hooves made their regular sound on the frozen ground. I came because I needed to find out if there was anything left, she said, of what we had before, whether it was still there under everything that happened to it. She paused. I didn't know if it would be. I'm still not sure. Neither am I, he said. They rode the rest of the way into town with the mountains at their backs and the cold around them, and neither of them said anything more. And that was all right, because some things needed to stay at the size they were for a while before you tried to do anything with them. The week after that conversation was calmer, on the surface, than it had any right to be. Luke went back to school on the Monday, which he greeted with the complicated enthusiasm of someone who had missed his friends while simultaneously dreading the quantity of arithmetic that had accumulated in his absence. He came home the first afternoon full of what Thomas had said and what the teacher had said and what had happened at recess, and he ate 2 helpings of supper and fell asleep at the table, which made Colt carry him to bed with the practiced ease of someone who had done it dozens of times, and which made Evelyn, standing in the kitchen doorway watching, feel something she was not going to examine right now. She helped with the evening dishes, which had also quietly become an assumption rather than a decision. And Colt washed and she dried, and they talked about the horse Pete was worried about and whether the northwest fence needed more work before the next snow, and the letter Colt had received from a cattle buyer in Cheyenne that might mean a good sale in the spring. It was ordinary, unremarkably, uncomplicatedly ordinary. She was aware of this as it was happening, the way you were aware of warmth when you'd been cold for a long time. Not taking it for granted, just noticing it, being careful not to need it too much before it had proven itself stable. On Wednesday, Gerald Marsh came to the ranch. Pete came to find Evelyn in the kitchen where she'd been making bread, a task she'd taken on partly because the house needed bread and partly because bread required sustained physical attention and she'd been restless. And he said in his careful, minimal way that Mr. Marsh was at the door asking for Mr. Brennan. "Where's Colt?" she said. "South pasture. I was going to go get him." "Do that," she said. "I'll ask Mr. Marsh to wait." She wiped her hands and went to the front door. Marsh was standing on the porch with 2 men behind him, both of whom had the studied blankness of people there to make a number look larger. He looked at Evelyn in the doorway, and his expression went through the same assessing sequence as it had in Ruth's store, but this time with an additional layer she read as surprise. Not that she was there exactly, but that she was in the house, wearing an apron, with flour on her hands, as comfortable as if she belonged there. She was, she realized, making a calculation of her own. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "Colt's in the south pasture. Pete's gone to let him know you're here. Would you like to come in and wait?" Marsh looked at the door, at her, at the flour on her hands. "I'll wait out here," he said. "Of course." She kept her voice pleasant. "It's cold. I'll leave the door open in case you change your mind." She went back to the bread. She could hear Marsh on the porch, the creak of his boots, the low murmur of him saying something to one of the men with him. She kept working the dough, which needed working, and she listened to the sounds of the house and the distant sounds of Pete crossing the pasture and the much more immediate sound of Gerald Marsh being made to wait on someone else's porch in the cold. And she thought about Ruth telling her that Marsh was strategic rather than clever. And she thought about the way Colt had looked this morning at breakfast. More settled than he'd looked when she'd first arrived. Less like a man bracing for something. And she thought about Luke coming home from school with crumbs of news about his day. And the bread under her hands came together properly, the way it did when you were paying attention. When Colt came in from the pasture 20 minutes later and went out to talk to Marsh, she stayed in the kitchen. She had no right to be part of that conversation, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she listened to the tone of Colt's voice through the front wall of the house, steady, unhurried, with a particular quality of finality that she recognized from the few times she'd heard him draw a line he meant. And she thought that Gerald Marsh was not going to get what he came for today. She was right. Marsh and his men left 20 minutes after that, and Colt came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "He raised his offer," he said. "What did you say?" "Same thing I always say." He drank the coffee. "No." "He's not going to stop." "No," Colt agreed. "He's not." He looked at her. "He mentioned you." She looked up from the bread. "He said he was concerned about my judgment, that I seemed distracted." Colt's voice was carefully neutral. "He suggested that outside influences could make a man lose sight of what was important." "And what did you say to that?" she said. Colt set down the coffee cup. "I told him that my judgment was my own business, and that the land wasn't for sale, and that if he came to my door again without an invitation, I'd consider it trespassing." He paused. He didn't like that. "No," she said. "I expect not." She shaped the loaf and set it to rise and didn't say anything else about it because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right now. Colt went back outside. The house was quiet. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the mountains, which were doing what they always did, being there, enormous and indifferent and permanent in a way that was either comforting or terrifying depending on what you needed from them. Today, she found them comforting. She wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but she was beginning to understand that some answers came slowly, and that trying to rush them only made them take longer, and that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was stay where you were and keep making bread and let the rest of it find its own shape in its own time. She was trying to be patient with that. She wasn't always succeeding, but she was trying. The bread she'd made that afternoon turned out well. Better than well. It had the right crust, the right density, the particular smell that filled a kitchen in a way that made the whole house feel more inhabited. Luke ate 2 thick slices at supper and declared it the best bread he'd ever had, which was probably an exaggeration, but was delivered with such complete sincerity that it was impossible to dismiss. Colt ate his without comment, which from him was its own kind of compliment, and Evelyn sat at the table that had become, without anyone formally deciding it, her table too, and let herself be present in the moment without pulling it apart to examine its components. That was new for her, the not pulling apart. She'd been doing more of it lately, letting things be what they were while they were being them, rather than holding every good moment at arm's length until she could determine whether it was safe. 5 years of Franklin Hale's house had made her a certain kind of person, watchful, always measuring the distance between herself and the nearest exit, never entirely at rest. That person didn't disappear because the circumstances changed, but she was learning, slowly and with some effort, to let the watchfulness rest occasionally without feeling like she was being careless. The ranch helped. There was something about the specific quality of its demands, physical, immediate, always something that needed doing, that was good for people who needed to be grounded in their bodies and their surroundings rather than living entirely in their own heads. She had discovered this about herself without expecting to. December came in the way Wyoming Decembers did, steadily, seriously, without much ceremony. The mountains collected snow that stayed, and the mornings acquired a cold that was different in character from autumn cold, less sharp, more total, the kind that settled in and meant business. The ranch prepared for winter the way ranches did, with a focus and efficiency that left little room for anything that wasn't necessary. Evelyn made herself necessary. She did not do this strategically, or at least not entirely. She did it because there was work to be done and she was there and capable of doing it, and because being useful was something she understood in her bones in a way she hadn't always had words for. She helped Pete winterize the barn, insulating the gaps in the walls, making sure the water line from the well had the protection it needed against hard freezes. She helped Colt go through the food stores and make a proper accounting of what was there and what needed to be gotten before the past became unreliable. She took over the mending, which had been accumulating in a basket by the bedroom door, in the resigned way of mending that nobody was going to get to anytime soon, and she worked through it over several evenings while Luke did his schoolwork at the table and Colt read or went over his accounts. Those evenings were the things she found herself thinking about most later. Not any particular conversation within them, but the texture of them. The lamplight, the fire, the sounds of the house settling in the cold, Luke occasionally asking her how to spell something or asking his father a question about arithmetic that Colt would answer without looking up from what he was doing. The ordinariness of it, the strange, fragile, entirely undeserved ordinariness of it. She was aware it could end. She was aware that she had no formal claim on any of it, not the evenings, not the ranch, not the family that was beginning to feel, around the edges of her consciousness, like something she might be allowed to belong to. She held it carefully, the way you held something you weren't sure was actually yours, and she tried not to count on it, while also not pretending it wasn't happening. Colt was different in December than he'd been in November. The change was incremental, and he probably would have denied it if asked directly, but she could see it. He talked more, but not dramatically more. He was still fundamentally a man of selective speech, but more. He asked her things, not just about the work, though that was usually the framing, but things that were actually about her. What she'd been good at before she was married, whether she'd always been comfortable with horses or had learned it, what she thought about the cattle buyer's offer from Cheyenne, whether she'd consider such and such about the south pasture fence. He listened to her answers the way he listened to Luke, like the information actually mattered. She found this more affecting than she'd expected, which annoyed her slightly. She was 32 years old and had no business being affected by being listened to as if she were a person with a functioning mind. And yet there it was. The trouble with Gerald Marsh did not go away because Colt had told him to stop. It got quieter. That was not the same thing. Ruth mentioned the first week of December that Marsh had been spending time with a man named Ira Sutton, who was a territorial land surveyor and who had a reputation for finding results that aligned with whoever was paying him. She mentioned it carefully, the way Ruth mentioned most things, as information, not alarm, with the understanding that what Evelyn did with it was her own business. Evelyn sat on it for 2 days and then told Colt. He was in the barn when she told him, working on a piece of harness by lamplight, because the short December days made it difficult to get everything done before dark. He listened without looking up, the way he did when he was thinking rather than dismissing. "Sutton," he said. "You know him?" "By reputation." A pause. "He found a boundary discrepancy on the Morrison place 2 years ago. The Morrisons disputed it for 6 months and ended up having to sell 3 acres to resolve the legal costs." She watched him work the harness. "What would a survey find on your property?" "Nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "Or nothing real. The northwest boundary is registered and has been since my father filed it in 1869. It's not ambiguous." He paused again. "But ambiguity doesn't have to be real to be useful in a legal context. It just has to be arguable." "Then he's building an argument." "Probably." He set the harness down and looked at her. "When did Ruth tell you this?" "Monday. Today's Wednesday." "I know. I was deciding how to bring it up." He looked at her for a moment with the considering expression she'd come to understand was not judgment, but actual consideration. "You don't have to manage how you bring things to me," he said. "Just tell me." "I know." She paused. "I'm still working on that." Something in his expression shifted. Not much, but she caught it. "I know," he said, and the way he said it told her he understood what she meant by still working on it, and that the understanding was not theoretical. "We need to get ahead of this," she said. "Yes." He picked up the harness again. "I'm going to ride into town tomorrow and talk to Jack Reeves. He's the closest thing Larimer Creek has to a proper attorney. I'll come with you." He looked at her. "If that's all right," she said. "It's all right," he said. They went to see Jack Reeves the following morning, and Reeves, a thin, precise man in his 50s, who looked like he had been constructed specifically to inhabit a small office full of paper, listened to Colt describe the situation with his full attention and the particular stillness of someone whose listening was a professional skill. "Sutton," Reeves said when Colt finished. "So I'm told. He's been active in this county, twice in the past 3 years. Reeves folded his hands on the desk. Both times the surveys found discrepancies that were later disputed, and later, in one case resolved in the landowner's favor after significant cost, in the other case settled for a partial land transfer." He looked at Colt. "Your filing from 1869 is solid. The question is whether Marsh can manufacture enough procedural confusion to make it expensive to defend." "Can he?" Reeves considered. "He can try. The best protection is documentation that's current and comprehensive. Survey your own land first. Get your own surveyor, someone with an unimpeachable reputation, in before Sutton can file anything official. If your records are already in order and already on file when his survey appears, any discrepancy, he claims, becomes immediately suspect." He paused. "It costs money." "How much?" Reeves gave him a number. Colt's expression didn't change, but Evelyn, sitting beside him, could feel the weight of it. On the way back from Reeves's office, she said, "I have money." Colt stopped walking. "Not much," she amended. "What I got from selling Franklin's things. It's not enough on its own, but it would help." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "This isn't your problem," he said. "I'm aware of that. I'm offering anyway." "Evelyn, I know what you're going to say." She stopped on the sidewalk and looked at him directly. "That it's not my land and not my fight, and it would put you in a position you don't want to be in. I understand all of that, but Marsh started using me as a reason to come after you, which makes it at least partly my problem, and I have money sitting in a tin that isn't doing anything. She paused. It's not charity. It's someone who has a stake in the outcome offering a contribution. You can pay me back in the spring when the cattle sell. Misan. He looked at her for a long moment on the cold main street of Larimer Creek, with people moving around them and the mountains visible at the end of every east-west street. I'll think about it, he said. That's enough, she said. She had said that to him before. He remembered. She could see it. The surveyor Reeves recommended was a man named Harlan Cross, who came down from Cheyenne and spent 3 days on the Brennan property with his equipment and his assistant, a young man who spoke almost as little as Pete and seemed to find this an appropriate quality in a person. Cross was methodical and unhurried, and delivered his findings in a written report that Reeves described as thorough and unassailable, which was exactly what they needed. Colt paid for part of it. Evelyn paid for the rest. She handed him the money matter-of-factly, without ceremony, and he took it the same way, and neither of them made a thing of it, which was how she knew the dynamic between them had changed in some fundamental way. They were past the point where every transaction needed to be weighed for what it implied. Cross's report went on file with the county registry the 3rd week of December. Reeves sent a copy to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, which he described as simply covering all the relevant bases. The copy going to Cheyenne was not simply covering bases. They both knew that. It was making the record visible at a level above Marsh's sphere of influence. Marsh did not appear at the ranch again. The quiet that followed his absence was a different quality of quiet than before. Not peaceful exactly, but watchful in the way that watchful things were when they hadn't decided what to do next. He's not done, Colt said one evening when Luke was in bed and they were sitting in the main room with the fire and the lamp and the comfortable wreckage of a full day. No, Evelyn agreed, but he's recalculating. What do you think he does next? She thought about it. Something social, she said. Legal and financial pressure didn't work quickly enough. He'll go back to something more personal, try to find a way to make you look like a bad decision to the people around you. Colt looked at her. You know how people like him think. I was married to someone like him for 6 years, she said. The statement was flat, factual, without self-pity. You learned the patterns. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'm sorry you had to. So am I. She looked at the fire. But it turns out it's useful now, so I try to think of it that way. That's generous of you. To yourself, I mean. She glanced at him. What do you mean? Most people aren't generous to themselves about what they've survived, he said. They find ways to make it their fault, or they carry it like it defines them. He was looking at the fire too, not at her. You don't do either, you just use it. She was quiet for a moment. I had to decide, she said finally. After he died, whether that was my story or just a story that had happened to me. She paused. I decided it had happened to me, that it wasn't who I was, it was just what I'd been through. Colt nodded slowly. Clara did something like that, he said. She had a hard childhood. She didn't talk about it much, but you could see the shape of it in how she handled things. She'd decided it was behind her without pretending it hadn't happened. He paused. I admired that about her. She sounds like someone worth admiring. She was. He said it without distance, without apology. It was a fact about the world, and he stated it as such. Luke has her practicality, and her patience when he decides to use it. Evelyn smiled. He is extremely patient about checkers. He's insufferably good at checkers. He beat me 4 times last Tuesday. He doesn't let me win anymore either. Something in Colt's voice was warm in a way she didn't often hear, unguarded, easy. Last month he beat me fair and then explained to me in detail what I'd done wrong. Detailed breakdown, like a general reviewing a battle. She laughed. It came out without her planning it, which was still slightly surprising to her when it happened. That's the most Luke thing I've ever heard. He gets it from Clara's side, Colt said. The tactical analysis. Her father was a chess player, serious one. He paused. Luke never knew him. He died the year before Luke was born. Does he ask about her, Clara? Sometimes. Less than he used to. Colt was quiet for a moment. When he was 4 and 5, he asked about her constantly. I answered everything as honestly as I could for a 4-year-old, which wasn't always very honest because some truths don't have shapes that fit in a 4-year-old's world. He shifted in the chair. Now he asked more specific things, particular memories. What she sounded like when she laughed, what she smelled like. He paused. That one was hard. What did you tell him? Lavender, he said. She always had lavender something, soap or dried bundles, or both. The bedroom used to smell of it for a year after she died. He looked at the fire. I told him that, and he nodded very seriously and didn't ask anything else for a week. The fire made its sounds. The house made its sounds. Outside, the Wyoming winter made its sounds, which were primarily wind and silence in alternating layers. You're a good father, Evelyn said. She hadn't meant to say it so directly, but there it was. He looked at her, a quick sideways glance. I make a lot of it up as I go, he said. Everyone does. The good ones just don't pretend otherwise. He looked at the fire again. Something in his posture had shifted over the course of the evening, less braced, less oriented toward whatever was coming next, more present in the room. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. What did you picture? When you got on the train? What did you think was going to happen when you got here? She considered this honestly. I thought you'd be angry, she said. I was right about that. I thought you'd probably tell me to leave. I was less right about that. I thought if I could just explain, if you could just know the truth, it would feel like enough. She paused. I was wrong about that. Wrong how? I thought knowing the truth would be an ending, she said. Something to close and put down. But it turns out it's not an ending. It's more like a beginning, or it could be if both people decide it is. She looked at him. I didn't know that when I got on the train. I'm not sure I'd have gotten on if I had. Why not? Because a beginning requires more of you than an ending does. He looked at her directly now, which he did less often than you'd think for someone who was generally unflinching. There was something in his face that she couldn't name, but that she felt in her chest in a physical way, like pressure that was looking for somewhere to go. I'm glad you got on the train, he said. She held that for a moment. So am I, she said. Most days. Most days. The first day I was less sure. The first day I was terrible to you on a train platform in front of half the town, he said. You were confused and hurt and had 5 years of reason to be both. She paused. It wasn't your finest hour, but I understood it. I should have listened before I concluded. Yes, she agreed. But you're listening now. He looked at her for a moment longer and then he nodded. Once, the way he nodded when something was settled. Not solved, but settled. Placed in the category of things that had been addressed and could be set aside. It's late, he said. I know. You should stay. The temperature's dropping and the trail's going to be iced by morning. Are you going to tell me Pete's mare knows the trail? I'm going to tell you I'd rather you stayed than worry about you on an iced mountain trail at 11 at night. She looked at him. The statement was so plainly made, with so little effort to dress it up, that it took a moment to take in its full shape. All right, she said. Acham. Christmas came to Larimer Creek the way Christmases came to small frontier towns, which was thoroughly. Ruth decorated her shop, and Donnelly's put colored ribbon in the window, and Margaret Finley produced a wreath for the hotel door that was significantly more ambitious than the building warranted. There was a gathering at the schoolhouse for the children, which Luke attended with the enthusiasm of someone who had been saving up social energy for weeks and now intended to deploy it all at once. Evelyn went with Colt to watch the children perform their songs and their short recitation pieces, and she sat next to Colt in the row of parents, and not quite parents, and whoever else. And when Luke found them in the audience afterward with the shining-eyed relief of a child who has survived a public performance without disaster, he hugged his father and then, after a brief calculation that she saw happen in his face, hugged her too. She held very still for a moment. Then she hugged him back and he smelled like pine resin and something sweet from the refreshments, and she thought, there it is. There's the thing you weren't allowing yourself to want. She did not cry in the schoolhouse. She waited until she was outside in the cold, where the sharp air made watering eyes defensible on other grounds, and she stood for a moment with her face tipped up toward the Wyoming sky and breathed steadily until the feeling became manageable. Colt came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He'd seen, she was fairly sure, but he understood the difference between a thing that needed to be addressed and a thing that needed to be witnessed and left alone. They stood there for a moment in the cold. He likes you, Colt said finally. an understatement of some magnitude. In case that wasn't apparent. It was apparent, she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. Good. He was quiet for a moment. So do I, in case that wasn't apparent either. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky, not at her, which she understood was how he was able to say it at all. It's becoming apparent, she said. Good, he said again. Luke came bursting back out of the schoolhouse at a dead run to tell them both about something Thomas had done during the recitation, and the moment ended, and they walked back to the wagon in the December dark, with Luke between them talking without stopping about Thomas and the recitation, and whether there would be more refreshments, and Colt caught Evelyn's eye over Luke's head, and something passed between them that was small and complete, and entirely sufficient for what it was. The last day of the year brought the trouble that Evelyn had predicted would come, in the form it had always been likely to take. She was at Ruth's store when Bettina Marsh came in with two women Evelyn didn't know and made no attempt to pretend they were there for anything other than what they were there for. Bettina looked at Evelyn across the shop with the composed expression of someone who had decided this was the moment. Miss Harper, she said. The Miss Landing with deliberate weight. Mrs. Marsh, Evelyn said, I've been meaning to speak with you. Bettina moved toward her with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this. As someone who cares about this community, about the people in it. I'm listening, Evelyn said. The Brennan family has been through a great deal. Bettina's voice was pitched for the room, not for Evelyn. Colt is a respected member of this community, and his son is a child who deserves stability. I'm sure you understand that a woman in your circumstances, however well-intentioned, can present complications that might not be immediately obvious to someone who isn't from here. Ruth had gone very still behind the counter. Evelyn looked at Bettina Marsh and thought about several possible responses. She thought about the diplomatic ones, the careful ones, the ones that would keep the temperature down and avoid giving Bettina what she'd come for. Then she thought about 5 years of Franklin Hale's house, of all the careful responses, of all the temperatures kept down at significant cost. Mrs. Marsh, she said pleasantly, I appreciate your concern for the Brennan family. I share it. Colt's a capable man who makes his own decisions, and Luke is a bright and resilient child who has handled more hardship than most adults I've met. She paused. What happens at the Brennan Ranch is a matter between the people at the Brennan Ranch, which, with respect, doesn't include you. Bettina's composure shifted. Not broken. She was too practiced for that. But it had a crack in it. There are people in this town, she started. I know what people in this town have been saying, Evelyn said, still pleasant, still even. Some of it's been said where I could hear it. I've been aware of your particular contribution to the conversation since shortly after I arrived. She met Bettina's eyes. I understand why you'd prefer I wasn't here. I understand the position my being here creates for your husband's business interests. But I'm not going to leave because it's inconvenient for Gerald Marsh's land acquisition plans. The room was very quiet. Bettina's chin had gone up in the way it did when she was reorganizing her position. I have no idea what you're implying about my husband. I'm not implying anything, Evelyn said. I'm saying it plainly, which I find works better. She picked up the packages she'd set on the counter when Bettina came in. I hope you have a pleasant New Year, Mrs. Marsh. She nodded to Ruth and walked out. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she was on the sidewalk, not from fear, from the specific adrenaline of having said something true out loud in a room that didn't want to hear it. She had done it once or twice in her life, and it never stopped feeling like stepping off a ledge and discovering there was ground beneath you, the surprise of the ground being almost as significant as the stepping. Ruth appeared beside her 30 seconds later, came out the door with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. That, Ruth said, will be all over town by supper. I know, Evelyn said. Are you all right? Yes. She thought about it. Yes, actually, I'm all right. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she made the sound that was between a hum and a laugh. Come back inside, she said. I'll make coffee, and you can tell me what she looked like when you said the last part. Evelyn looked at her. You were right there. I know. I want to hear your version. Evelyn laughed, and it came out easy and real, and she followed Ruth back inside out of the December cold, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the train in Larimer Creek, she felt something close to settled, Not finished, not safe in any permanent sense, but settled in the way of someone who had found the ground under their feet and was learning, day by day, to trust that it would hold. The story Bettina Marsh told about what happened in Ruth Aldcroft's store traveled through Larimer Creek in the way that stories always traveled in small towns. Faster than facts, slower than feeling, and with certain details rearranged by each telling to fit the shape of what the teller already believed. By the version that reached Margaret Finley by supper time, Evelyn had apparently accused Gerald Marsh directly of criminal fraud in a voice loud enough to rattle the windows. By the version that reached Pete Jessup the following morning, she had reduced Bettina to tears in front of witnesses. Neither was accurate. Evelyn had been composed and specific and had walked out while Bettina was still standing. This was, if anything, more significant than the dramatized versions, but it was less satisfying as a story, and so the story grew. Colt heard about it from Pete, who told him with the brief economy of a man reporting weather conditions. Observable fact, no editorial comment. Colt listened and said nothing and went back to what he'd been doing, which was repairing the south barn door hinge that had been giving trouble since November. Pete, who knew when a silence meant something had been processed and when it meant something was still being processed, left him to it. When Evelyn came to the ranch that afternoon, Colt was still in the barn. She came in out of the January cold and found him there, and he looked up and said, "I heard what happened at Ruth's." "Which version?" "Pete's version, which I assume is the closest to accurate." "Reasonably close," she said. She came further into the barn and sat on the workbench in the way she'd taken to doing, without asking, because it had stopped being the kind of situation where she asked. "I probably could have been more diplomatic." "Did you say anything untrue?" "No." "Did you raise your voice?" "No." He went back to the hinge. "Then it sounds like you were diplomatic enough." She watched him work. Outside, the wind was doing what January wind did in Wyoming, which was everything at once, first sharp and then steady, and then dropping suddenly to a cold that felt deliberate. "She'll come at this from another direction now," Evelyn said. "Probably." He fitted the hinge, checked the alignment. "Marsh filed a request with the county last week for a boundary review. Reeves told me this morning." She went still. "He's moving. He's moving." Colt set down the tool he was holding and turned to look at her properly. "Reeves says our documentation is solid. Harlan Cross's survey is on record and it's current. The review is going to find exactly what our survey found." He paused. "But it's going to cost time, and there's going to be a period where there's a formal dispute on record, which Marsh can use socially even if he can't use it legally." "He wants to make you look unstable," Evelyn said, "like someone whose land situation is uncertain. Makes it harder to sell cattle to buyers who want clean contracts." Colt looked at her. "That's exactly what Reeves said." "It's what Franklin did to people," she said. "Not the same circumstances, but the same method. Create enough administrative noise that the other person's time and energy go into defense instead of forward motion." "What did the people Franklin used it on do?" "Most of them settled. Cheaper than fighting." She paused. "Two didn't. One of them lost. One of them won, but it took 4 years and the legal costs were nearly as bad as losing would have been. So there's no clean option. There rarely is." She looked at her hands on the workbench. "But there might be a faster one." He waited. "Marsh wants the Northwest pasture because of the water rights," she said. "That's been the goal since the beginning. Everything else, the surveys, the boundary review, Bettina and the social pressure, using me as a reason to question your judgment, all of it is just means to that end." She looked at him. "What if we gave him what he actually wants, in a form that doesn't cost you the land?" Colt frowned. "Explain." "A water rights agreement, negotiated directly, with terms that give Marsh documented access to the Northwest water at agreed rates and conditions, but leave the land and its title entirely with you. He gets what he actually needs for his holdings. You keep the pasture and remove the reason he has to keep pressuring the boundary." She paused. "Reeves could structure it so the agreement is binding and specific. No room for expansion of scope later. No implied claims on the land itself." The barn was quiet for a moment. The wind found a gap somewhere and the lamp flickered. "He might not take it," Colt said. "He might not. But if we offer it publicly, say, through Reeves on the record, and he refuses it, he loses the sympathetic framing he's been operating with. Right now, he's the concerned citizen worried about a boundary dispute. If he turns down a fair water agreement, he's just someone trying to take land. Colt looked at the hinge he'd repaired. He looked at the barn door. He looked at the way it hung now, level, the way it was supposed to hang. Then he looked at her. "When did you become a strategist?" he said. "I've always been one," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to use it for." Something moved in his face. It was brief and she almost missed it, but she didn't miss it, because she had been paying attention to his face for 2 months now and she knew most of its geography. "We'll talk to Reeves tomorrow," he said. Jack Reeves received the idea with the enthusiasm of a man who appreciated elegance in a legal solution, which it was in its way. He spent 2 days drafting the water rights agreement with the specificity of someone who had been around long enough to know that vague language was where future problems came from, and then he sent it formally to Gerald Marsh's attorney with a cover letter that was professional and courteous, and which made absolutely clear, in the way that professional and courteous language could be made clear, that this offer was on the public record, and its rejection would also be on the public record. Marsh's attorney came back in 3 days with a counteroffer that expanded the scope in ways Reeves rejected immediately. Reeves sent back the original terms unchanged. Marsh's attorney took another 4 days. Then he accepted. Reeves brought the signed agreement to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late January and set it on the kitchen table and said, with the understatement of a man who considered displays of satisfaction undignified, "That's resolved." Colt signed his name on the line and passed the pen to Evelyn without thinking about it, which meant she'd been signing things here before, and neither of them had particularly noted the transition point. She looked at the document for a moment. Her name wasn't on this one. It was Colt's land, Colt's agreement. She put the pen down. Reeves noticed. He was a precise man. He noticed things. He said nothing about it. After he left, Colt looked at the agreement on the table and said, "That's done." "For now," Evelyn said. "He'll look for something else eventually." Eventually, Colt looked up from the document. "But not right now, and right now is enough to work with." She thought that was probably the most practical sentence she'd ever heard, and also possibly true about more things than land disputes. What? Luke found out about the Marsh situation the way children found out about things that adults had been carefully not mentioning around them, by being quietly present and paying closer attention than anyone had accounted for. He came to Evelyn 2 days after the agreement was signed, on a Saturday when his father was out checking the herd, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table with the expression of someone who had been organizing thoughts into an argument. "Is Mr. Marsh why people in town are mean to you?" he said. Evelyn set down what she was mending. "What do you know about Mr. Marsh?" "I heard Papa talking to Pete about the water rights thing." He looked at her with the directness that was either his best quality or his most challenging one, depending on the moment. "And Bettina Marsh's boy Thomas told me at school that his mother says you're trouble." "Thomas told you that?" "He didn't mean it mean," Luke said, with the loyalty of someone defending his best friend's mother's bad judgment. "He was just saying what she said. I told him his mother was wrong." Evelyn looked at him. "What did Thomas say to that?" "He said probably." Luke picked up a button from the mending pile and turned it over in his fingers. "His mother is wrong about a lot of things, he thinks, but he doesn't say so at home." "That's wise of him." "Yeah." Luke set the button down. "Evelyn, are you going to stay?" She had been waiting for this question to come back around. It had the quality of something that had been waiting patiently to be answered properly. "That depends on several things," she said carefully. "Like what?" "Like whether your father wants me to." Luke looked at her with the expression of someone encountering an unnecessary obstacle. "He does." "You're very confident about that. I know my father." He said it simply and with complete certainty, the way he said things that he had examined and concluded were true. "He's different since you came. The good kind of different." He paused. "And he fixed the kitchen window latch." She blinked. "What does the window latch have to do with it? It's been broken for 2 years. He only fixed it last week." Luke looked at her with the patience of someone explaining something that should be obvious. "He fixed it because you were the one who kept catching it wrong. He doesn't fix things for himself very fast. He fixes things for other people." Evelyn sat with this for a moment. It was possibly the most oblique and accurate expression of affection she had ever encountered. "I see," she said. "So are you going to stay?" She looked at him. This boy with his father's dark eyes, and his mother's practicality, and his own particular stubbornness, and the particular loneliness of a child who had grown up in an adult world that had done its best by him, but had still left gaps that were the shape of things he didn't have words for yet. She thought about what it cost to want things. She thought about what it cost not to. "I want to," she said. "Very much." Luke nodded, as if this confirmed his own prior research. "Okay," he said, and picked the button back up and handed it to her. "This one goes on Papa's blue shirt, the third button from the top. It's been missing since October." She took the button. "Of course it has," she said. Colt chose a Sunday afternoon. She would think about that later. The fact that he'd chosen a Sunday, the quietest day. When Luke was at Thomas's house for the afternoon and the ranch had the particular stillness of a place whose usual activity had paused, and the winter light came through the windows at a low angle and made everything look like something you'd want to remember. He came in from outside and she was in the main room reading or making the motions of reading while actually thinking about the button conversation with Luke and what it meant and what she was going to do about what it meant. He sat down in his chair and looked at the cold fireplace for a moment and then looked at her. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something," he said. "All right," she said. She set the book down. "I'm not good at—" He stopped. Started again. "You know I'm not someone who says things well. I say them accurately, usually, but not always well." "I know," she said. "I like that about you, actually." He looked at her. "I know where I stand with you," she said. "That's not a small thing." He was quiet for a moment. "When you came off that train," he said, "in that dress, I was angry. I had 5 years of something built up, and you walking back into it was like—" He worked for the right description, like having a wound you'd been managing suddenly opened again. "And I wasn't kind. I know I wasn't. We've been through this. I know, but I'm not finished." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "What I didn't understand then, and I've been understanding slowly since, is that I'd been managing the wound for 5 years instead of actually healing it. I'd made a version of myself that didn't need to deal with it, didn't need to deal with—" He paused. "With wanting things. With being someone who wanted a life that was bigger than what I'd managed to build in the aftermath." Evelyn was very still. "Luke needs more than I can be by myself," he said. "I know that. I've known that for a while, but that's not—" He stopped. "I'm not talking about Luke. I mean, I am, but that's not what this is about." He looked at her directly, the way he did when something was important enough to require it. "I want you here. Not because Luke needs someone, not because the ranch is easier with 2 people, not because you've turned out to be useful with horses and legal strategy and bread that Luke would apparently eat an entire loaf of by himself, given the opportunity." The corner of his mouth moved. "I want you here because you're someone I want to be around, because you make the world make more sense to me than it did before you got off that train." She was quiet for a moment. The low winter light moved across the floor between them. "That might be the most words I've heard you say at one time," she said. "Probably is." He looked like he was going to say something else, then decided not to. "Colt." She leaned forward slightly. "I want to be here. That's not in question. It hasn't been in question for a while now. I just didn't know if I'd been given permission to say it." "You don't need my permission." "I know, but I needed yours anyway." She paused. "This is your home, your life, your son. I wasn't going to plant myself in the middle of it without being asked." "I'm asking," he said. The 2 words were plain, and he didn't dress them up. And that was exactly right, because dressing them up would have made them into something smaller. "Then yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at the fireplace, and then he got up and started building a fire in it, because it was January and the room was getting cold, and that was so thoroughly himself that she had to look away for a moment to manage her expression. "There's something else," he said, stacking kindling. "The water rights agreement. Reeves noticed that you'd been signing things here, that your name was on the household accounts and the store orders." "I can stop." "I don't want you to stop." He struck the match. "I want it to be because it's accurate. Not because you've been helping out, but because this is actually your place." He watched the kindling catch. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm telling you that I'm not in a hurry and that whatever pace makes sense, we'll go at that pace. But I wanted you to know what I'm thinking." She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the fire he was making. "I know what I want," she said quietly. "I've known for a while. I'm not afraid of it." He turned around. He looked at her in the firelight with the expression that was fully his, entirely unperformed, the face of a man who had stopped managing the distance between himself and what he felt. "Good," he said. "Neither am I." There was one more thing that needed doing, and Evelyn did it alone. She wrote a letter to her father in Claremont. She sat at the kitchen table on a Monday morning in early February while the ranch was going about its day around her, and she wrote it by hand in her plain, clear handwriting, and she took 3 attempts before she had a version that said what she meant without saying more than she meant. She told him she was alive and well. She told him where she was and something of what her life looked like now. She told him that she understood, in the way that took years to arrive at, what he had been afraid of and what choice he had made in that fear. She told him that she had not forgiven him entirely, because forgiveness at that scale was not a decision you made once, but a direction you chose to keep moving in. And she was choosing to move in that direction even if she hadn't arrived anywhere definitive. She told him she didn't need anything from him, that this letter was not an opening for a relationship that both of them would need to rebuild carefully if they chose to, or not build at all if they didn't. She told him that she was telling him she was alive because he was her father, and he deserved to know. And because carrying around the withholding of that information had started to feel like something she was doing to herself as much as to him. She sealed the letter and addressed it and gave it to Pete to take to the post office in town. Then she went to find Colt and told him she'd written it because she had decided that sharing things was no longer optional for her, that the version of herself who kept everything private and internal because the alternative was dangerous was a version she was finished needing to be. He listened to her describe the letter and what was in it, and when she was done, he said, "How do you feel?" "Lighter," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. "Good," he said. "Not finished," she added. "I know it's not finished. Things like that don't finish," he said. "They just change shape." She looked at him. "When did you become wise?" "I've always been wise," he said. "I just don't talk enough for people to notice." She laughed, and he smiled. The full version, the one he gave to Luke and to her and to very few other people. The one that changed the architecture of his face into something entirely different from its everyday configuration. And she thought, This is the thing you rode 2 days on a train to find, even when you didn't know that was what you were looking for. The town of Larimer Creek adjusted to Evelyn Harper the way towns adjusted to things they had no choice about, gradually, unevenly, with some people revising their opinions faster than others, and a few people never revising them at all. Bettina Marsh remained cool toward her indefinitely, which Evelyn accepted without particular distress. Gerald Marsh, having gotten his water rights agreement, and having discovered that no further legal maneuvering was likely to gain him additional ground, redirected his energies toward a property dispute on the other side of the county that apparently offered more profitable conflict. His interest in Colt Brennan's Northwest pasture quietly retired. Gerald Pratt, at the train station warmed up by spring, in the slow, weather-beaten way of someone who takes facts seriously and accumulates them over time until they outweigh the story he'd been given. He started nodding to her in the street. By May, he was exchanging a few words. By summer, he held the door for her at Donnelly's, which was a complete reversal, and he managed it without acknowledging the prior state, which was the most dignified way to handle it. Ruth Aldcroft remained herself throughout, which was reliable and sharp, and occasionally funny in a dry way that Evelyn had come to look forward to. They developed the kind of friendship that didn't require much maintenance because it was founded on mutual respect and honesty, rather than on social proximity, which meant it survived the times when Evelyn was busy at the ranch and didn't come to town for 2 weeks, and it survived Ruth's occasional directness about things Evelyn might have preferred to process privately, and it survived being exactly what it was without either of them needing it to be more. Luke turned 8 in March and demanded a fishing trip as his birthday celebration, which Colt organized with the slightly resigned efficiency of a man who understood that the fish were unlikely to be cooperative in March, but that this was not the relevant point. Evelyn went. She had never fished. Luke taught her with the precise patience he brought to Checker's instruction and the deep satisfaction of someone who gets to be the expert. She did not catch anything. Luke caught two, which he described in detail for the entirety of the ride home, and which grew slightly larger with each retelling, a habit he had clearly inherited from somewhere that was not his father. Colt and Evelyn were married in April, on a Friday afternoon in Jack Reeves's office with Ruth and Pete as witnesses. There was no ceremony beyond the legal one. Evelyn wore the blue dress she'd bought at Ruth's store in November, which fit her properly and which she could move in without thinking about it. Colt wore his good jacket and had made an attempt at his hair that Luke had commented on with insufficient tact. Reeves made them sign the document and shook both their hands and said, with the warmth of a precise man permitting himself a small departure from precision, "I think this is the right outcome." "So do I," Evelyn said. They had a meal at the Finley Hotel afterward because Margaret Finley would have been devastated to be excluded from the occasion, and also because her cooking was, as advertised, genuinely good. Margaret produced a cake that was entirely unexpected and slightly lopsided, and tasted excellent. Luke ate 2 pieces and fell asleep in the wagon on the way home, and Colt carried him inside and put him to bed. And Evelyn stood in the main room of the house that was now her house and looked at the lamp on the table and the fire in the hearth and the mending basket in the corner and the checked game on the side table that had never been fully put away because it was always available to be played. And she thought about a train station platform in November and a woman in a faded wedding dress with $9 and some change and a photograph she hadn't let herself look at. She thought about what it took to get from that to this. It had taken truth, which was harder than she'd expected to give and harder for both of them to receive than she'd hoped. It had taken patience, the kind that had nothing to do with passivity and everything to do with staying present through the parts that were difficult without demanding that they be over sooner than they were ready to be. It had taken work, real, physical, daily work, the kind that reminded you who you were when the rest of it got too complicated. And it had taken a willingness to want things again after wanting things had been dangerous for a long time. That last one was the hardest. She didn't think people talked about that enough. How fear and self-protection could look like wisdom for long enough that you forgot they weren't the same thing. How surviving something could make you so good at managing loss that you started managing away things that weren't actually lost yet. She had almost done that. She had almost managed away the kitchen and the fire and the lopsided birthday cake and the boy who fell asleep in wagons and the man who fixed window latches for people he loved without saying that was what he was doing. She was glad she hadn't. Colt came back from putting Luke to bed and found her standing in the middle of the room and stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "He was asleep before I put him down," he said. "He had a long day of fishing and cake. He held up well. He always does." Colt came into the room and stood near her, and they looked at the fire together for a moment the way they'd been doing since November, except that now there was no version of this where she'd be riding back to a hotel room in the dark. "Evelyn," he said. Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things now, not the reflexive find she'd trained herself to produce on demand, but the actual answer. "Yes," she said. Genuinely. She paused. "I'm aware that might change, that things are going to be hard sometimes, and we're still learning each other's difficult parts, and there's going to be days when Wyoming is cold and the cattle market is bad, and Luke is impossible, and neither of us is particularly pleasant to be around." "Probably," he agreed. "I'm not expecting it to be otherwise." "Neither am I." She looked at the fire. "I think that's actually the important thing," she said. "Not expecting it to be easy, not needing it to be perfect, just deciding it's worth it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "It's worth it," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those steady, honest eyes that didn't perform anything, that just showed her what was there. "Yes," she said, "it is. Later that spring, when the snow was leaving the mountains and the northwest pasture was green for the first time since Evelyn had seen it, she was out checking the fence line with Pete when she stopped and looked at the view that opened up from the top of the ridge. The valley below, the town a small cluster in the distance, the ranch buildings neat and purposeful in the middle distance, the mountains beyond everything else holding the whole picture in place. She had been a woman on a train platform 4 months ago, alone in the specific way that people who have been isolated for years were alone, not just without company, but without any clear sense of what they were for or where they belonged. She had come here with the frayed end of something old, hoping it might be retied. It hadn't been retied. That was the thing she understood now that she couldn't have understood then. You didn't retie old things. They were what they were, damaged in the ways they'd been damaged, and the only honest option was to make something new with the materials you had, which included the damaged parts. The new thing would have those damages in it, woven into the structure, visible if you looked. But it would also be stronger in those places, for the same reason that bone was stronger where it had healed. She had not gotten her life back. She had gotten a life. Different from what she'd imagined at 22, built on different ground, carrying different weight, harder in some ways than the life she'd thought she was going to have, and better in ways that the 22-year-old version of herself wouldn't have had the vocabulary for. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. Pete, who had stopped a few feet away and was looking at the same view with his characteristic economy of expression, said, "Fence looks good up here." "It does," Evelyn said. "Mr. Brennan fixed the north section last week." "I know. I helped." "Right." Pete looked at the fence. "Good work." It was, from Pete, a significant endorsement. She looked at the valley one more time and then turned back to the fence line, because there was more of it to check and the afternoon wasn't getting longer, and work that needed doing was best done while the light was good. She pulled her coat around her against the April wind and walked forward, and the mountains stood at her back exactly the way they always had. Indifferent, enduring, enormous. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, she felt them not as a weight at her back, but as something else entirely. Something like ground. Something like enough.